everyone to our Q2 Cybersecurity Insights webinar. We are welcoming today a guest from E2E Assure, Dom, who will be introing himself shortly. Thank you very much for signing up to join our webinar today. We're going to be walking through a discussion of the threats and developments which have been front and center for our teams during Q2 and Q1 of 2024. And then we'll be pivoting into a conversation with Dom and the E2E team, particularly around MDR, which will be led by my colleague, Chris. But before we jump into the content, we do have a couple of admin points to cover. So on the first point, we would really love for you to ask any questions that you have during the webinar. And so as you will see in the top bar of your Teams meeting today, you should have a Q&A tab. The Q&A tab should be there for you to ask any question you might have. That is for literally anything you might want to cover in this session. But if there's something urgent that you might think is relevant for the section we're covering, don't hesitate to ask that at any time during the session. We will, of course, leave some time at the end for those questions if you do want to leave that to the open floor at the end of the webinar. And then on the second admin point, we of course can't kick this off without introducing ourselves. So I'll kick that round off and introduce myself. So it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm the host for today, and my name is Tim Geschwin. I'm Deputy Head of Incident Response here at SRM for the European Cyber Incident Response Team. My role really is to lead on the response to major cyber criminal incidents, for example, ransomware and major network intrusions. And I've been at SRM now for 7 years.
My name's Chris Ormond. I head up the incident response team here in the UK. I joined SRM in 2023, so I've been over a year and a half here now in role. Previously, my experience through my working life has been all around digital forensics, incident response and cybersecurity for well over a decade. My role here at SRM is to manage the team that in response to all of these incidents, but also to take on some of the more complex and highly sensitive cases as well, of which we see quite a few. So that's me. Thank you very much. Dom.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I'm Dominic Carroll. I'm the Director of Portfolio at E2E Assure. So I define and execute on our services strategy. We obviously provide threat detection response services from our SOC in the UK, and we've been doing so for around 10 years. I've been doing technology, products and service development for about 18 years, and 8 of those have been in pure play cyber. And for the last 12 months, we've been evolving the E2E Assure offering. We specialise purely in what we do best, which is threat detection response. And we obviously work with partners and other organisations to kind of fulfil that complete end-to-end cyber services lifecycle.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dom. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So just to kick off what we're going to cover. So we're going to start with unpacking a little bit of information around the threat landscape, looking at key trends and some of the key numbers that we've seen during our review of the data on our side over the last 12 months. We'll then go through a quick look at the Lockbit takedown. Now, for those not familiar with Lockbit, it's a major ransomware group, and we'll be having a look at some law enforcement action that has targeted the group recently, and some of our post-takedown observations. What really does this activity mean for the broader threat landscape? I'll try to keep it short and snappy, but naturally, of course, we will ideally be talking about this for probably 15-20 minutes before we hand over to Dom and Chris to walk through their conversation around managed detection and response, endpoint detection and response, and some of the nuances around monitoring and what best practice looks like. Kicking off then with the threat landscape update. So really there are 4 key trends that we've been looking at SRM Cyber Incident Response. And the first one really relates to geopolitical tensions. Many of you will be aware that when a ransomware attack takes place, many of these groups are operating from Russia or the former Soviet Union, what we call, of course, the Commonwealth of Independent States. And what is now a de facto well understood aspect of these attacks is how many of these groups query the keyboard layout that the device they're running the ransomware has to essentially determine whether you are a victim in Russia and the former Soviet Union or outside it. If you are within those countries, the ransomware in fact kills itself. And if an intrusion is staged in one of these countries, typically we see the ransomware group in fact offer a free decryptor. And what are we seeing really? What does this tell us? What it tells us is ultimately, while financially motivated and part of a financially motivated ecosystem, the groups that are staging many of the high-profile attacks that we're responding to are in fact based in jurisdictions where the geopolitical tensions that underpin these relationships aren't going anywhere. Russia and, for want of a better phrase, the West are not suddenly going to solve their issues regarding Ukraine and elsewhere over the next couple of years. And similarly, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East and between North Korea and the United States and China and the United States are driving these incidents. And ultimately, without conclusion or at least some sort of lightening of the relationships between these countries, unfortunately, the drivers behind why these attacks are happening are going to continue. On the second point, when I started my career in ransomware response, there was a vanilla attack chain that you could almost draw it before you walked into the intake call, and it usually started with a phishing email that would result in a Trojan or a bit of malware, and ultimately you'd be ransomwared. We only saw 7% of our incidents last year come as a result of a phishing incident, whereas software vulnerabilities has absolutely taken front and center. Whether it be a software vulnerability that is exploited en masse, for example, Clop with the Move It vulnerability, where they get into dozens of clients at the same time or victims at the same time and do a mass semi-automated attack, or whether it is just the steady release of vulnerabilities like VPN vulnerabilities and others that are being constantly essentially sought out by major ransomware groups and also researched. These are giving ransomware groups and other cyber criminals access to networks, whereas they may have usually relied on user error, clicking on links and the like in the past. They now rely on essentially 0 days in software that are pretty difficult to remediate quickly. And so the ransomware groups typically have a bit of a leg up. The last two that I'm going to cover very quickly are as a service. So we're seeing a lot of phishing as a service, ransomware as a service, Trojans as a service that are essentially software as a service setups, business models in which the creators of the ransomware, the malware, the phishing are essentially leasing out access to these setups to cyber criminals who likely don't have the experience or sophistication to make these tools themselves. But in doing so, they lower the barrier to entry and allow unsophisticated, what we might call script kiddies, to conduct much more sophisticated attacks. And really that lowering barrier to entry is allowing for an influx of what we would consider less sophisticated cyber criminals into attacks that previously required a much more advanced skill set. And that relates, of course, to adversary in the middle phishing, AITM phishing. So typically we used to believe, well, multi-factor authentication sitting in front of your emails, that means you won't get breached. And at least that means that you've remediated the risk of invoice redirection fraud and other related intrusions. Unfortunately, one of the trends we've seen over the last 12 months is that as a service, that phishing as a service model has really bled into the absolute uptick in adversary in the middle phishing, where they can essentially, it doesn't matter if you have MFA, they can intercept your authenticated cookie, session cookie, a little bit of data that is essentially telling the service that you have entered the correct username, password, and MFA code. They can intercept that, inject that into the browser, and then log in as you, even with MFA in place. And we've seen this being really impactful against law firms. Moving on. Oh, that jumped a little bit too far. Real headline figures, and I won't spend too much time on this because I think anyone who's had a cursory look at the news will see these similar headlines. The key numbers are ransomware is increasing. The frequency of incidents is increasing year on year. What you can see on the graph on the right-hand side there is the orange line is tracking incidents in 2024. The less orange, more cream colored line is tracking the incidents from last year. And generally, we are seeing an increase across the board month on month. I believe as of the last month, we had a 23% increase in April 2024 versus the numbers equivalent in 2023. We are seeing, though, this is not resulting in an increase in claims in insurance. It appears that what is happening here is there is a massive increase in ransomware hitting small to medium enterprises at these less than 500 employee bracket. And so 76% of all incidents that we saw last year impacted this employee or rather organizational size, what we would call SMEs, small to medium enterprises. However, unfortunately, we are seeing a large number of attacks impacting healthcare, financial services, and construction. Healthcare in particular, an unfortunate focus, and one we've seen ramping up in the first 5 months of 2024. However, it's not all bad news. We have had some positive moments this year. One of them would be the Lockbit takedown. And so on the 19th of February, we started hearing reports of, well, actually, let me be honest, before the 19th of February, we started to hear whispers from some of our partners in the law enforcement space. What that typically looks like is you get called into a meeting with someone from one of the intelligence agencies, likely for a case you're already working with them, and they give you a bit of a heads up. Look, something's happening. Watch out for something in this space over the next few weeks. And it's a bit of a courtesy from these groups to say to you, look, we know that you're likely negotiating with Lockbit. We know you're likely looking for a decryptor. They want to at least give us a bit of a hint that something's coming so that we don't do something silly like make a payment and then in fact no decryptor can be handed to us because Lockbit's just gone down. Nonetheless, on the 19th of February, we started to see outages on Lockbit's leak site. As you can see, the screenshot there is what the Lockbit leak site typically looks like, but with some adaptions. The next day, this is essentially what Lockbit's leak site looked like on the dark web. It had been seized by law enforcement, and they had reformatted it in a pretty jazzy way to really show front and center that the NCA, in collaboration with the FBI and others, had seized them, and there was seized the infrastructure. Sorry, that's really important, not seized them, because the individuals themselves, none of which were arrested in the administration team, and a couple of Lockbit affiliates were arrested in Ukraine and in Poland. Ultimately, though, within 4 days, Lockbit had recovered their network. They had restored from backups, which is, of course, what we advise and wish most of our clients can do in an incident response case. And within a day, we started to see a flurry of new victims being posted to their leak sites. However, Lockbit did realize that Lockbit SUP, in this instance, the administrator did realize he had made an error. Not only were his servers out of date, which had resulted in the hijacking by law enforcement in the first place, but he had built a ransomware as a service program that was unwieldy and bloated. And so he essentially got rid of a bunch of low sophisticated people that had joined the program in 2023 but hadn't conducted any successful attacks, and he really started to tighten up some of the processes and procedures within the organization. Unfortunately, just like with incident response, where our clients will get an incident and then afterwards be in a much more mature position and fixed many of the issues that were pervasive before the incident, Lockbit as a ransomware group did very much the same. And then a couple of weeks ago, the police brought back the sites, the hijacked sites, and they said, essentially, we're going to be releasing the identity of Lockbit SUP. And 2 days later, on the 7th of May, they identified Lockbit SUP to be Dmitry Koroshev, an individual living in Voronezh, south of Moscow. He does own a Mercedes, like the intelligence agencies had claimed in February, but not proved. And we did find, in fact, by following the intel around Dimitri, we did in fact find a Mercedes for sale at a second-hand car auction just south of Moscow. We believe he was doing some irresponsible driving practices with it, which may have burned out some of the car's core components. It's funny what you can find out about an individual just based on a name. Ultimately, though, I think while it's been fantastic to see, and the takedown impact has resulted in a reduction in the number of lockbit attacks, and you can see in the graph on the top right there, the blue dot is in fact when the takedown occurs, there is an absolute drop-off in the number of incidents. The operation has significantly disrupted ongoing response efforts. And to be honest, one of the negatives is that law enforcement did sort of tell the world, look, we've got all the decryption keys. So if you've been the victim of lockbit ransomware over the last 12 months, reach out, we'll give you this decryption key. Unfortunately, our response has been, or our experience rather, has been less optimal. I think at this stage, and Chris, do correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we're yet to receive a decryption key for any of the, I believe it's 46 lockbit cases that we had in the 12 months prior to the takedown. And so while some of the optimism around the takedown has not manifested in great outcomes for our clients, I think there's still a lot to be positive about. Ongoing successful disruption of Lockbit and groups like Lockbit really does suggest that law enforcement is focused on the right groups. They are starting to have success. And ultimately, the takedowns are resulting in operational disruption of these groups. At the beginning of this year, you'd have said that there were two major organizations conducting cybercriminal or ransomware attacks in the space. The Pepsi and the Coca-Cola of ransomware. And that would have been Lockbit and that would have been Black Cat. And now I'm speaking to you in May of 2024 and Black Cat doesn't exist and Lockbit is limping on, but is now sanctioned and we believe will receive very, very little work over the next few months. And so I do want to end the threat landscape piece with that slight positive. At this point, it's time to get into the conversation with Dom and Chris. And so I'd like to hand over to Chris at this point to lead on that discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. Very insightful and a lot to chew on, I think. So yeah, we're going to be moving on to a conversation with Dom from E2E Assure. This section of the webinar will be concentrating on MDR, so managed detection and response, and also the tools that are deployed as part of that service, and some of the insights that we've seen around clients that may have EDR or even MDR and yet are still being hit with incidents to date. So the real message here is, why is this not a silver bullet? And there's a lot of nuance to this, and there's a lot of interesting insights that we can gain. So EDR, or Endpoint Detection and Response Tool, has been around for a good few years. It is primarily marketed as the next step in antivirus protection, but it's a little bit more than that. It's around the sort of behavioral analytics of processes that are executed within your environment and trying to stop the bad before it happens, and using machine learning and active scanning to perform that. So as you can see on this slide here, we do have some interesting metrics. We've got 33% of ransomware victims last year had EDR. Now, if EDR is the silver bullet that some clients believe them to be, then why is it still the case that they are being hit by ransomware attacks? And interestingly, of those 33%, 70% of those cases, the EDR was fully deployed across that environment. So if all of the machines are protected by this solution, then why is it that we're still seeing ransomware attacks? I think the primary concern around the deployment of EDR is really the configuration of those tools. So, it used to be the day where you would deploy Sophos or Symantec or Norton antivirus, and you would install it, and it would be a little symbol in the bottom of your tray, and you'd have protection. obviously that very quickly became obsolete, and threat actors were wise to how to navigate around this. And so EDR was developed as the go-to tool for that advanced level of protection. However, because it is so advanced, and because it does need to be configured correctly, you need to ensure that those with the specialist knowledge to configure it specifically for your environment do so. Otherwise, threat actors will be able to manipulate and use techniques such as living off the land, or using, natural or default tools that come as part of your Windows operating system or Mac operating system to then affect their attacks. Additionally, even though EDR is deployed, we often see that for those that are dealing with it in-house specifically, when it's misconfigured, we see a lot of alert fatigue. And so, for instance, you will have an EDR tool that's spread across your entire environment, but because it's overly aggressive, then the IT teams will then allow things more and more and not pay attention to those alerts because they think it's part of the normal course of the tool conducting its work. However, with that alert fatigue and with that overly permissive allow listing, it does offer the opportunity for threat actors to hide under the radar and execute their activity without being properly monitored and captured. Just on that point, Dom, what are your thoughts around EDR and its configuration?
Yeah, I mean, all the points you said, Chris, I mean, we've experienced an awful lot of that. I mean, obviously we come in a lot of times after clients being ransomware, and what's generally happened is they have an EDR, but there's different modes in which you can deploy those tools. And the kind of most benign mode is what we call audit mode, and that's where if the EDR agent is seeing something that might be suspicious, it will log it. But if the kind of level of severity it's logging against isn't appropriate for the type of threat it's seeing, then that log might be alerted to a central platform, but it'll sit buried under a whole load of other alerts and logs that are vying for the analyst's attention. And the scenario we've heard about quite often is, customers have bought this tool, they think it's great, they deploy it, they switch everything on, and then, as you say, they get all this noise, all this disruption, so they turn it off. Because EDR can do an awful lot in terms of containment automatically to kind of stop threats in their tracks, but it needs to be tuned to a specific organization. It needs to be set in the right mode. So we talk about something a lot which we call attack disruption, and attack disruption isn't just a technical capability of the EDR tool, but it's that technical capability of the EDR tool in combination with understanding the client's environment and tuning the two accordingly with each other. So there's a few things we do, and that we recommend to do to other organizations might be deploying this, and that's we will take kind of historical logs from a client, and we will tune against that. So when we activate EDR in what we call active response mode, so when it sees a threat that we know is a threat within the organization, it can take automatic action, such as it might temporarily disable that device from the network until an analyst has had a chance to triage that and see that, yes, this was, indeed, it's a true positive high-level threat, so we need to get that machine rebuilt, or actually, no, it's a false positive. So we can re-enable that machine on the network, and we need to retune that alert so it doesn't create any more false positive alerts. So yes, so those things you're seeing here. If you think it's a fire and forget piece of technology, it's not going to be as effective as you may hope. It needs kind of lots of human in the loop collaboration, a lot of ongoing management and tuning to kind of really get the best out of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think another important piece around the EDR tooling specifically is not just the EDR itself, but the supporting monitored logging and appliances that form part of that protective measure. And as we can see on this next slide, monitoring itself is not a silver bullet. So when we say monitoring itself is not a silver bullet, I think we're talking about the monitoring of EDR specifically. So as some of you may or may not know, managed detection and response is slightly different to managed endpoint detection and response. The clarity here is that managed EDR is specifically when you either in-house or outsource the monitoring of your endpoint detection and response tool to provide that 24/7 eyes on glass to respond and react to those alerts that are coming through. However, as we've said before, EDR is not a silver bullet. It's focused primarily on your systems and your software and the processes that run on those. So if you are focusing on one aspect of that, what you are ignoring is the network connections. You're ignoring the perimeter defenses. You're focusing solely on the internal. And I think where MDR comes into play, the sort of more holistic view of that, is when you start plugging in things like SIEM tools and SIEM solutions, data loss prevention solutions, implementing your firewalls into a single pane of glass or a SOAR to have that monitored and protected. So whilst EDR itself is not the sort of silver bullet, actually a combination and layers of those security techniques and monitoring solutions will give you the best benefit and give you the best foot forward in trying to combat these types of incidents. Don, just before we move on, is there anything that you'd like to say around the sort of wider MDR piece?
Yeah, I mean, it's key to remember that, obviously, as you mentioned, EDR, the agents, as great as these tools are, they will only pick up what's happening on the device that they're installed upon. And as Tim mentioned during his brief, there's a lots of different avenues coming in, whether it's compromising vulnerabilities like a VPN server or using identity attacks or adversary in the middle. A lot of these things don't touch the user's device, the endpoint. So having multiple detection surfaces to match what the attack surface is really important. So we talk about defense in depth. I think we need to think about detection in breadth and depth to make sure that what we can detect in terms of a detection surface matches our attack surface. So for adversary in the middle, for example, if someone's managed to steal a user's MFA token and is trying to use that to log in, can we detect that that's not coming from the user it's supposed to or from the area it's supposed to? These things are quite complex, but they can be achieved with the right level of kind of tuning and a bit of innovation on the side. So yeah, there's more avenues for the attacker to get in than just compromising and doing things on a particular computing endpoint. So they really need to bear that in mind. And network detection response can pick up command and control communications if the attacker does have initial access and is ready to activate a ransomware campaign. Really need to think about the different stages of the attack. What are the data sources where we can pick up signals of that stage of the attack, and how do we tune that appropriate for the particular business?
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think whilst we're looking at this slide, and you may see that there's some metrics that we haven't touched upon yet, I think when we talk about monitoring, there are various aspects to monitoring, and what we'd like to touch on is a few things. So as you can see on the slide, 63% of victims had monitoring in place for their EDR. Now, some of this was outsourced. As you can see, 65% of those that were being outsourced, being monitored, were being outsourced. Now, there's a couple of key points here. One, of the 63% with 65% outsourced, that means the remaining 35% were monitoring it in-house. Now, depending on the size of your business, especially if we're talking, as Tim spoke to, the small to medium enterprises, the cost required to monitor that 24/7 and having the right configurations in place and the expertise to respond and detect and configure to those alerts, it can be quite expensive. And so really the outsourcing is a cost-effective mechanism to make sure that you do have those eyes on glass. However, when we're looking at some of the statistics here, even outsourcing can have its issues. So really you need to make sure that you're focusing on the right partners for your business, to make sure that those partners are not asleep at the wheel, to make sure that they have the right playbooks in place, to make sure that they have the right toolkits and the right mechanisms to integrate your solutions into their monitoring platforms. Additionally, with the internal teams, and we touched on it on the previous slide, alert fatigue is a big killer. if you have many alerts, or if you've had an incident and the follow-up is you've played whack-a-mole for, 2 to 3 months and you're still seeing the telltale signs, but not necessarily, in-flight attacks, then that sort of alert fatigue there could very quickly revert into a full-scale attack again. And that's where we really need to be careful. Dom, obviously you're part of an MDR business, the importance of having the right people with the right skill sets and the right technology. You got any insights for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really challenging for a business whose core objectives in business is not cybersecurity to have the right level of skills and retain those right level of skills. Because of just the asymmetrical nature of attacks. So things can be quiet for several months, you can get lots of false positive noise continually. But when a true positive happens and you're really under attack, everyone needs to be match fit and ready. And if you're getting those very infrequently and people are not kind of being exposed to all the threat intelligence happening all over the globe and kind of getting a chance to kind of practice their art and being around the same level of talent, it's difficult to then, when something does happen, to have the right people in the right place. I mean, I'm running a 24/7 team. Obviously, it requires a certain number of staff. That comes at a cost, especially when those teams need a certain level of skills and qualifications. So that needs to scale, and for a kind of a medium-sized organization, having a team like that in house, it's just difficult to justify that investment for most businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the final point that I really want to touch on around the monitoring piece is calling back to that wider holistic, as you said, defense in depth and in breadth, is actually the protection that EDR offers, as we've said, shouldn't be the sole solution. I think what is most prevalent and most insightful there is that, as we saw with an antivirus, so your Windows Defender or your Sophos or Norton antivirus, threat actors very quickly found mechanisms to navigate and uninstall or disable those tool sets. And whilst EDR was relatively new, it was very rare and almost unseen that those sorts of bypasses would affect your EDR solutions. Nowadays, we are seeing that threat actors have those mechanisms to hit really at that kernel level, that very sort of basic machine level, to unhook those EDR tools from those systems. And that's where it's really important to make sure that not only do you have the holistic view of your environment, but you have the right people in place 24/7 to identify when an attack occurs. Is that going to happen to your system, and what mechanisms can you put in place to combat that? Dom, obviously an opportunity to speak out on that.
Yeah, and I think as part of that, it's having the right kind of operational monitoring process in place as well. So if attackers are managing to kind of get in and disable your agent, that in itself should throw up a potential critical alert to say something's going on here. This agent that should be working on this user's device has suddenly gone dark. Should we look at that? But if this is happening at 3 a.m, having somebody who understands that is a risk. Again, you need to have the right people in the right place at the right time. So attackers, as you know, will choose their moments wisely. They're quite kind of strategic in their thinking about when they're going to kind of activate certain stages of their attack. When they'll kind of choose it on a Friday night of a bank holiday weekend, for example, when they think everyone's away and won't be back till Tuesday. So yeah, having a 24/7 team of people who are on the ball all the time, regardless of what's happening, is really crucial.
Yeah, and touch wood, with a bank holiday coming up this weekend, that none of that hits anybody on this call. Tim.
Yeah, just to jump in with a question from the audience. Are small to medium enterprises being targeted more? And why is that? Surely they won't be able to pay as much in ransom.
That's a very good question. I think it's all down to volume. So as you might expect, the amount of small to medium businesses is growing more and more. But the ability to purchase security tools and security solutions and the outsourced monitoring to have that suite of protection in place is quite costly sometimes, especially if you don't have the right people or the right vendors, and you sort of go for the first vendor at the top of your Google list is sometimes not the most beneficial, and it's difficult to find the right people that will do the right job. So volume, I think, is a key piece. I also think that, as with the bigger businesses, and especially if you're thinking about banks that have strict regulatory requirements, or those that are operating in the public sector or have public sector contracts, they will have the regulatory pieces to make sure they have the best protection afforded to the data that they're handling. And so therefore you're seeing, your mom and pop shops down the road, or your small franchises within regions rather than nationally or globally, getting hit more and more often because they either don't have the expertise, the knowledge, the people, or they can't afford the technology to do so. Dom, anything from your side?
I think to add to that, I mean, obviously from my kind of products and service development hat on, it's very much a products and services life cycle on the cybercrime underground. As he talked about, these ransomware as a service, and there's affiliates. There's people who specialize in credential harvesting. It's very easy and low cost for your common cyber criminal to launch an attack, but they're going to have very low success against a business that's got decent defenses. They're a much harder target. So as 0 days become commoditized packages, most businesses with a decent level of cyber maturity will implement the necessary measures to protect themselves against that. That may not have flowed downstream to small and medium enterprises at the same rate that common cyber criminals can try and exploit that en masse. So I think they're going after the easier picking, low-hanging fruit at scale rather than the bigger, harder targets that with the bigger payouts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to answer the second part of that question, surely they won't be able to pay as much in ransom. It's an interesting discussion point there, where some of these smaller businesses might be able to get a good level of insurance, and I think that's partially what threat actors are relying on, is that they'll have a pool of funds behind them to be able to pay those ransoms, subject to sanctions limitations. But also, as is our role when we're dealing with threat actor negotiations, there's an element of, even though the ransom might be hundreds of thousands of pounds, they're going to try their best to try and eke out whatever money they can from this through their attack. So even if they're demanding $1 million, if they come out the back of it with 150,000, it's still money off the back of their efforts.
Just one probably final comment from me on this, I'm going to jump in, is I suppose one of the key words in the question was around being targeted. I think it's probably worth noting that, at least from our perspective, most of the time targeting doesn't really come into it. Targeting is something that we usually see when we're responding to. So, for example, we were responding to an incident in Hong Kong last year, impacting a large IT MSP, and it became very clear that the chain of events was far too deliberate and intentional for it to have been an opportunistic attack. It was clear that this was in fact a target, and by the end of the case, the forensics team had really drilled it down to being a North Korean state-backed intrusion to try and ultimately get into all of the downstream clients of this IT MSP in Hong Kong, which, as you can imagine, due to the geopolitics which I mentioned earlier, you can see why that might be something you would target if you were a North Korean state hacker. However, I think for most of the financially motivated cybercrime we respond to, most of it's opportunistic. You're scanning the internet for the latest vulnerability impacting Citrix, and 10,000 instances come up. Most of the time, they don't go through those 10,000 instances to decide who are they going to hit first. It really is about, I come from South Africa, so I often think about it in terms of a herd of antelope and sort of the lions chasing them. They find whoever has been separated from the pack and is most vulnerable and take that opportunity rather than targeting a specific member of the herd. And maybe that helps with understanding why SMEs are being impacted, is just because there's more opportunities, which I think both Dom and Chris have spoken to really well. I'm going to throw it back to you, Chris. I don't think there's any more questions at this point, but I do encourage anyone. There's one more.
One more question. So at the moment, I think the only question I can see is, you mentioned phishing is less of a threat, but is it still worth educating staff and defending against? I think, obviously, Tim, you'll have some insights, but if I could take a first stab, I think it really goes back to that old adage that you're probably tired of hearing, is that humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity. I think even though the trends are declining for phishing, they're still prevalent. I mean, if we're talking about attack, like adversary in the middle attacks, for instance, it's still phishing. If we're talking about social engineering through phones, that's still vishing, I think is the term. So phishing is still prevalent and it's still important. And I think if we took a downward trend to mean that it's not as prolific, I think that would be the point where, without training and educating staff and keeping them up to date, that strong link, as certain businesses are really sort of focusing on that phishing training, is strengthened. If that falls off, very quickly phishing will become the main point of attack again. So we really need to keep the ante up on phishing training. Tim, anything on your side?
No, I think maybe I'll throw it at Dom. Dom, what are you seeing in terms of, or your view on phishing and a declining trend? I assume you probably view it similarly to us in terms of an arms race, and one decline can quickly be followed by an incline.
Yeah, well, as soon as you become complacent in one area, then the attackers will be all over it. So it's, once you kind of strengthen one pillar of your security, it's important to kind of try and keep that momentum in that area while trying to move on where the attackers are focusing next. It's so easy to take your eye off the ball, and you just know that as soon as you do, then there's going to be a surprise attack waiting around the corner. So it's just signal. I think obviously the decline in the attempts at phishing in that sense, in the traditional sense, is a testament to the phishing training and everything and all the communications that have been happening. But we definitely can't take our foot off the gas with that.
Agreed. Chris, I'm going to jump in with another question for you and Dom. One from Jordan here in the chat. The increase in construction sector attacks is interesting. Any thoughts around why threat actors are targeting this sector more frequently?
Yeah, good question. I think it's not specifically the construction sector per se, but targeting sectors in a sort of round robin type attempt. I mean, if we look at business email compromises specifically, currently there's a massive uptick in law firms being hit. And what we assume and what we might see in forums is that threat actor groups will have intelligence that says, law firms at this moment in time generally might have poor cybersecurity, and if you're looking at them, performing things like large conveyancing transactions and things of that nature, they could become quite easy targets. So I think in terms of why the construction sector is seeing an uptick in their attacks is likely due to a number of attacks already being conducted and the intelligence being shared there that actually this is quite lucrative, and the affiliates as part of those threat actor groups are taking their resources and directing it towards those because they've heard that they're quite lucrative there.
Yeah, one observation from my side, I dealt with a very large construction case 3 weeks ago, and probably the largest case of my career was in December for a cement manufacturer, actually across 72 different countries, and absolutely everything was destroyed except for one Commvault backup server at every single cement factory across each of the 72 countries, which involved a lovely deployment to each of those countries to go on site and rescue those single server setups. But it taught us a lot about how construction firms typically a low margin business, small profit margins, but quite high revenues. What we kept hearing from the internal teams at this very large construction firm was very, very low cybersecurity budgets, and that in a very under pressure industry, and construction has been under economic pressure for a while now. Budgets have just been siphoned elsewhere, and the cybersecurity budget has been in stasis really for 5, 6, 7 years and hasn't increased to meet the threat, really, the evolving and increasing threat. And the other point was there is a lack of, many of the construction firms we deal with have networks that are awfully similar to what they built when they created their company 20, 30, 40 years ago. And there hasn't been this constant upgrading and updating cycles that you have to, by regulations, do in things like healthcare, finance, banking, etc. And unfortunately, they just don't have those profit margins to reinvest into massive upgrades to security programs. So I do think that also probably has an impact.
Yeah.
Right. No other questions coming through, so I'm going to hand back to you, Chris, at this point, and probably to the next slide.
Fantastic, Tim. Thank you very much. And just another point, if you do have any other further questions, please do fire them through. We can talk about this for hours, but we'll be very happy to answer any of those questions. So really the importance of the right provider. I mean, I'm going to be quite biased here, and from my point of view, working with a provider that knows their stuff, working with a provider that has the technology, the skills, and the understanding of not only what the client needs, but also in a response scenario, what is required of that response is absolutely invaluable. I think when we look at some of the incidents that we've dealt with, the smoothest ones and the ones that can recover the quickest are actually a collaboration between the incident response teams and an MDR firm to make sure that not only are the incident response teams focused and directed to where it's essential, so in the outset, containment and business restoration to limit the interruption, but it also sort of alleviates the need for those resources to spend inordinate amounts of time to sort of protect those systems that might not otherwise have been protected. So the deployment of EDR is often one of the first steps that we take. But if we have a partnership with the right providers that are in-house ahead of time or can very quickly spin up and help us in incident, it's absolutely invaluable to really react within that golden hour within an incident. The expertise that are involved, I mean, when you can rely on those that have the knowledge and the internal escalation to only bring to the incident response teams the actual alerts that are of material benefit to the investigation and to the active containment process, really sort of streamlines that incident response and is really quite key to it. Dom, anything that you'd want to say from the other side of the house?
Yeah, I mean, but it's obviously I mentioned before about from the monitoring of the threat detection, the monitoring side, obviously very asymmetrical nature of threats, and it's obviously it being hard for organizations to do that in house, and that construction, storage, and TIM is like kind of highlighted that to quite an extent. So obviously we from the right provider from our side, from the kind of threat detection response side, we purely focus in on that. So there's no kind of trying to shift between budgets and focus in other areas. We do that kind of SOC piece to the point of diminishing returns, which obviously we can never get there because the threat landscape moves so fast. But working in hand with an incident response provider, we can not only make sure that we're detecting things as early as possible, but that when things do happen, when critical alerts, that we've got the right backup with the right partner to kind of get that contained and eradicated as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things that we should keep in mind is that when you are looking for a provider, it's really to sort of drill down on their capabilities and their process. I think too many firms that we see rely on just playbooks or rely on a lot of buzzwords and automation to make sure that the big ticket items are captured, but really it's making sure that those firms that you do partner with and that we partner with have the expertise, the knowledge, and the insights to actually understand when things are not quite right and doesn't fall into a playbook or an automated alerting mechanism, can they still pick it up? can they still respond to that? Do they have the right authority and capability to stop an attack in its tracks? That's really, really important to me. Dom, any sort of final points on what the members of this call can do to make sure that they're partnering with the right people?
Yeah, make sure that they have validate the type of expertise they have in the SOC. Make sure you can kind of have a view of their processes, that providing you visibility and transparency of everything that's going on, and that they can kind of give you that clarity of where you are today, things you can do to improve, and are continually looking to evolve your level of maturity in the threats you can detect and contain. Yeah,
I really think one of those sort of key words is partnership, right? What you don't want to buy is SOC as a service. What you really want is a partnership, one that really understands the infrastructure, understand what's going on inside the environment, and works with the end client to make sure that the services being provided are appropriate for the technology that they run. So yeah, important stuff. Dom, any final points?
I mean, I guess just to say that obviously, we understand this is hard. It's not an easy thing to kind of get this right. We've been doing it for 10 years, so this is not kind of to be prescriptive about what people should and should not do. Obviously, but people can get in touch, and we're all kind of in this journey together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dom. Appreciate the chat. Tim, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Wonderful. So that was a really interesting part of the webinar. And I think, to be honest, we've already answered a couple of questions, but this section really is open to any questions. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically about the topics we've covered here. You do have in front of you three folks who are involved in a lot of different aspects of incident response and MDR. And so if you have anything, please do drop that in the Q&A now. While we just wait for that, I do want to flag something that came up as a bit of an example of where it can go wrong. I had an incident 6 weeks ago now, and the client had a pretty good endpoint detection and response tool, one from Sophos called Advanced Intercept X. We think it's a pretty decent tool. It identified on a PC that was being shared by 5 or 6 people on a shop floor. It flagged that on that PC there was a bit of malware that had been ran, what we call Bloodhound. Now Bloodhound, for those who know it attempts to really map attack paths based on the structure and how you've essentially configured your network. Now, for incident responders, Bloodhound it's pretty serious. If you see Bloodhound being run on an endpoint, you know it's someone with hands-on keyboard, so a hacker actually with access to a system, trying to understand how they go from device X to device Y, and device Y hopefully being for them a domain controller or a file server or a backup server. Unfortunately, the client did what most clients do in this situation. They look at the alert and they see that the software that they spend an exorbitant amount of money on every year has told them, hey, I flagged some malware. This is not good. We've killed it. And for the client, that was the end of the story. Malware identified by an antivirus tool that is cleared and killed. That used to be exactly how you would respond to something like that happening in a corporate network. Your antivirus is killing malware. Whoop-de-doo. That's what it was bought for. The problem is you need that expert layer, and Dom mentioned it earlier around the right provider. If you do this as your day job, you know that that isn't the end of the story. If someone has run Bloodhound from that PC, the next question you need to be asking is, okay, so how did they get on the PC? Do they have a foothold on the PC? How are they accessing that? Is Bloodhound the only thing they've run? Is it only malware? Have they run other tools that wouldn't flag as malware? When did the intrusion start? has the activity really been properly stopped? How do we manage to terminate that access and prevent any further activity from happening? And unfortunately, the threat actor knew this and did what I would do, and what all of the rest of us on this call would probably do, is you put your head below the parapet and start hiding for a bit. And so they didn't run Bloodhound again. They didn't run any malware. In fact, they just started to browse on the file server that was mounted on the device, so you could literally just browse through the file share until they got to the IT folders, which had passwords in Excel spreadsheets related to key services. And from then, they were just logging into admin accounts as the legitimate users and quickly started to move around the network. And the next alert that was in Sophos Advanced Intercept X was, unfortunately, your agent has just been disabled and removed from the file server. Your agent has just been disabled and removed from the domain controller. And then within 35 minutes, the ransomware started to be executed. It's a small flag. It's a small alarm that is easy to miss. And yet you sort of needed to know what Bloodhound was to have done the right thing there. Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, not on this, but we do have a question in the chat. In your experience, how better prepared to a cyber incident are organizations that perform incident response exercises regularly? Is there a clear cause and effect between stress testing policies and processes versus a better recovery from cyber incidents? Do you want to take that one, Tim?
I'll throw that one to you.
Absolutely. So yeah, great question. I think the key thing around tabletop exercises and incident response exercises is making sure that people understand their role. They understand who to escalate it to. They understand what the immediate actions are, and they understand exactly who's supposed to be where at the right time and how to get in touch. The worst thing that we see is that without these sort of tabletop exercises, without these policies in place and stress testing them, you'll often find that IT teams spend hours trying to investigate what's going on. They'll spend hours trying to resolve this one issue when they don't have a full, wider understanding of the problem. And obviously, most importantly, they won't have insights into the business policies of when to activate their insurance, when to activate, their MDR team, when to activate incident response teams, or anything like that. And really, it's, as I've said, those golden hours of reducing that time to respond is incredibly important. And so, really, stress testing those and making sure your policies are fit for purpose for your business and your technologies and teams is really to reduce that time to respond. And any reduction in that time to respond will hopefully limit the impact of any cybersecurity incident. Hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. And we have one other question, which is, out of curiosity, can I ask the panelists what measures they have in place for their own personal cybersecurity at home, on the move, etc.? Dom, Chris, do you want to take this one?
Do you want to go first, Dom?
Yeah, sure. For me, it's trust nothing and no one. I always kind of, in terms of anything that comes in that I don't recognise or don't expect, I always kind of double check, second guess, and yeah, always validate that what I'm receiving is who it's from who it says it should be, and is has the right intent, the purpose, and with that mindset, move forward for everything that comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some practical steps that I personally take. I mean, one, I'm not suggesting you do this, but I have my own advanced router that has significant encryption protection on it. But for your own routers, so your typical Virgin hubs or BT home hubs or whatever it is, it's just spending 5 minutes just logging into that router, disabling or changing your default account and default password, making sure that it's not accessible, will stop threat actors getting into your environments at home. Making sure that you have a decent and well-recognized named antivirus software. Now, I'm not suggesting you need endpoint detection and response on your PCs at home. I don't think that's entirely necessary, but for having an antivirus solution, even Windows Defender correctly configured, I think it would be good. And then when you're out and about, I personally make sure I refrain from accessing freely available Wi-Fi sources. You may have heard this before, but if you go to your local coffee shop or even on the train where you have free Wi-Fi available, anybody can access that. And as we've seen, adversary in the middles very quickly become man in the middles, and they can access all of that data traffic quite quickly using a VPN of some type. So I'm not going to name brands here, but there are a number of VPNs that you can sort of download and install on your phones or on your laptops and PCs to help protect against those sort of active threats out there.
That's a great answer. Alrighty, I think that is it in terms of our time is up. Thank you everyone who has joined today. The questions have been fantastic, and I think I speak for everyone on the call when I say, Dom, having you join the webinar and offer your insights has really, really added a level of insight that we could absolutely not possibly offer ourselves on this subject. And yeah, it was great chatting with you. And for everyone else on the line, if you do want to reach out on anything MDR related, please do make sure to reach out to Dom Carroll and his colleagues at E2E Assure on that point. You're in very, very safe hands with them. And if you need anything incident response related or cyber threat intel, don't hesitate to reach out to Chris or I. Thank you very much for joining, and speak soon.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye now.